religion can't be divorced from social, political, and historical contexts and issues. And so what we're going to do today is do the first of two lectures. Now these are going to be sort of dreary, boring, typical Martin lectures. Dreary and boring historical survey. And I just have to do it today on the Greco-Roman world, tell you everything you need to know about the Greco-Roman world, at least for this semester. And then next Wednesday, because remember we're not meeting on Monday, next Wednesday I'll do a similar kind of lecture for everything you need to know about ancient Judaism to put the New Testament into its historical context. So you'll just have to survive these two very historical survey lectures because it's material that you need to know. I'll try to make it as interesting as I humanly can do. We now find the New Testament in the same book as the Old Testament, as Christians call it, and as Jews call it, the Hebrew Bible or the Tanakh. Clearly, early Christianity has got to be studied in the context of ancient Judaism, and so we'll do so next time. We'll look at the Jewish context, for example, for the development of the New Testament and early Christianity. But to understand Judaism of the time of Jesus and Paul, which is centuries after the chronological end of the Hebrew Bible, we need to understand Judaism as a Greco-Roman cult. It is a Greco-Roman religion. And that means we need to understand at least a little bit about the Greco-Roman world. For us, we can start not so all the way back at classical Greece, but with Alexander the Great and the beginning of Hellenization. That is, the Grecization of the eastern part of the ancient Mediterranean. That's all Hellenization means, making it Greek. Alexander the Great's father was Philip II, king of Macedonia, king of Macedon, and he conquered different Greek city-states by defeating Athens and its allies at Chaeronea in 338 BC. And I've got some of these names and some of these dates on the handout that you have before you. Alexander himself was born in 356. He was educated, BCE of course. He was educated by Aristotle beginning in 343. He was made king after the assassination of his father in 336 BCE. As your textbook points out, as Erman points out, and you probably already know, but for some of you who this may sound like odd lingo, I'm using CE for the Common Era, which is exactly the same thing as AD, and I'm using BCE for before the Common Era, which is back the same dates as before Christ. We in religious studies tend to like these terms rather than BC before Christ and AD, because AD actually stands for Anno Domini, in the year of our Lord. And because we in religious studies include people in our departments who are in Judaic studies, Islam, Hinduism, all kinds of religions, you can imagine that people who in other religions might not want to call things in the year of our Lord, since Jesus is not their Lord. So in simply the interest of reflecting the plurality of our own departments, we tend to use these terms rather than BC and AD, but it means the same thing. Alexander defeated the Persian army, which at that time controlled all of Asia Minor, modern Turkey, and had even threatened to control Greece. He defeated the Persian army in Asia Minor at Granicus, the Battle of Granicus, in 334. That put Alexander and his Macedonian army in charge of both Greece and Asia Minor. When Darius II died, who was the king of the Persians, Alexander himself took on Darius's title, which was Great King. After defeating the Persians again, he pushed his army all the way to the Indus River in India, to the western part of what's now India, and what was then called India also by Greeks. He wanted to go all the way to the Ganges River, but his army forced him to turn back. He died in 323 when he was not yet 33 years old, and he died in Babylon of a fever. That is, of course, modern-day Iraq. After his death, his empire was divided up among his generals, and after some fighting and maneuvering and negotiations, 4 successors to Alexander the Great finally ended up splitting up his large empire into 4 smaller empires. And we call these 4 successors simply the Diadochi. I think that's actually not on your handout, so I'll write it out for you. This is a Greek word that simply means the successors. So the diadochoi, in the Greek plural diadochi, as we often refer to it, ended up splitting his army into 4 parts and 4 dynasties descending from the 4 successors. There were 4 generals of Alexander. Now, next time in my lecture on introducing you to Judaism, I'll talk about the importance of at least 2 of these empires because they're very important for the history of Palestine and Israel at this time. But for now, all you need to know is that these 4 different kingdoms, one was where we now have Greece, another one was where Syria is, another was Egypt, and then there was another further north. But that's not as important for us. The Syrian Greek Empire and the Egyptian Greek Empire will become very important for the history of Judaism and Jesus himself also. But for right now, all you need to know is that all of these generals, although they were Macedonians and had spoke Macedonian and not themselves Greek, but they had, just like Alexander, they had adopted Greek language, Greek culture. They educated their children in Greek ways. Alexander, of course, had been educated by Aristotle when he was young. And so he had adopted Greek language and Greek literature and a lot of other Greek ways. What Alexander had wanted to do was to take all these different peoples who spoke different languages and had different customs and use a Greek layer to sort of unite his empire overall. Now, he didn't really care about the lower class people so much. So they could just still live in their villages and out in the country and do their farming and speak their own local language. But if you were going to be elite, he wanted to establish cities throughout his empire that would be actually Greek cities. And he wanted to have the elite people all be able at least to speak Greek. You have, therefore, one world. And in fact, this whole dream of Alexander, and it was a very self-conscious propaganda campaign and a cultural campaign on Alexander's part, he wanted to make one world. You really have, therefore, for in some way the first time in history, a dream of making all of his empire basically universal, a dream of a universal vision for one world under one kind of culture, one kind of language. This really hadn't been attempted. You see, in the previous empires, like the Assyrian Empire or these kinds of the Egyptian Empire, when people conquered other peoples, often all they wanted was tribute. They just wanted taxes and food and money and that sort of thing. They didn't really care about turning those people into Egyptians or into Assyrians. And Alexander didn't really care that much about the lower classes doing that, but he still wanted the elites. And so he would plant Greek cities and settle his veterans in different parts of his empire, in Egypt, in Syria, all the way over, sometimes in the western part of India. And he would take his veterans of his army, and he would drum them out of the army when they retired, and he would give them land, and they'd build a city there. And that city would be just like a Greek city back home. And they all would speak what developed to be a common form of Greek, slightly different from classical Greek. And we call that Koine Greek. And Koine is just a Greek word that means common or shared. So the Bible is actually written in Koine Greek because this was the form of Greek that had become spread around the Eastern Mediterranean by the time the Hebrew Scriptures were translated themselves and by the time the New Testament writings were themselves written. The Greek polis, which is simply the Greek word for city, had several institutions that are very important, and they'll become important for early Christianity and for Judaism. So you need to know what some of those are. The polis itself is just the Greek word for city, but you can't think of this as in huge cities like we have now. What they would call a polis might only be 1,000 citizens or 5,000. So it wasn't like millions of people. It wasn't nearly as big as Rome, which would consist of 1 million inhabitants fairly quickly around this time. The polis, that's plural for Greek city, the polis or the polises, they were much smaller than that. But they would have several things. The city of the center, the town, would be the center of this, and that's where the institutions would be. That's where the government would be. That's where the different buildings would be that I'm going to explain later. But the polis also included the surrounding farmland and the villages. So Athens was the polis for Attica, but it was also the polis for all of Attica, all that region around Athens, including villages and farms and other small towns too. So there was a rural dependency on these Greek cities. They all practice a certain kind of Greek education. The Greek word paideia, which is right there on your handout, means education, but it also means more than simply rote learning or memorization or learning to read like we think. Paideia is the Greek word that means the formation of the young man. And I say young man because throughout all this, it was mainly young men and boys who were educated. Girls could be given some education if their families were wealthy enough, but the cities didn't really concern themselves so much with girls' education. Their family might. But the cities concerned themselves with the education of their boys. So paideia referred to the education of the young man, both mentally, but militarily, so you were taught to fight, and culturally, you might be taught other things about culture. You might even have some music training or something like that. The place where this took place was the gymnasium. Now, the gymnasium doesn't mean what it means to us in English, the gymnasium, like Payne Whitney over there. It actually comes from the Greek word for naked, gymnos. And the reason it was called the naked place is because, of course, young Greek men always exercised in the nude and played sports in the nude. And so this is where you did it. So where did you do this? That came to be called the naked place, the gymnasium. But this also became the place where you would do other kinds of learning. So if you were learning rhetoric, for example, you might practice giving speeches at the gymnasium. But also men in town would just kind of gather there. It was kind of the place where men gathered, and they'd gone to school the same place. You would meet your friends. You might play some games. You might you play like checkers and these kinds of bone knuckle bones games that you can still see if you travel around in Greek cities throughout the ancient Mediterranean. You can see where they've carved little game boards into flagstones of different temples or buildings in Greek cities. So this would all take place in the gymnasium. You also had what they call the ephebeia. When you were a young boy, you would have studied just reading and writing Homer. When you got to be about the age of what you guys are here, you might enter the ephebate. You would become an ephebe. And that just meant that you were past your sort of early secondary training, and now you were being really in training to be a warrior and a citizen. So the ephebes were those boys who were between the age of maybe 16 or 17 and 20 or 22. You would march together in a parade in town. You would go on military training perhaps together. You would also engage in sports together, and you would develop a camaraderie because you were expected then to be the fighting force for your city-state. So the ephebate, or the ephebeia, was this institution that every boy had to go through in order then to be a full citizen of the city. You all had these political structures that are in your handout. The first political structure is the demos. Demos just means the people. It's just the Greek word for the people. But it actually referred more in politically to all of the male citizens. And in Greek cities, by tradition, only men were citizens of the city. This will change in Rome because in Rome, women were citizens also, although that didn't mean they were equal to men. But in Greek cities, men were citizens and women weren't citizens. But with the revolution of democracy in Athens, which also spread then to other Greek cities, partly because Athens did what George Bush tried to do in Iraq. They tried to force democracy on other Greek cities around the Eastern Mediterranean also. So democracies of some sort existed in different places. And in a democracy, the demos meant all the men of adult citizenship. That is, it excluded men who lived there who came from elsewhere. It excluded foreigners, it excluded some laborers, it excluded slaves, and it excluded women. But all the men who were citizens had a vote, and the demos referred to that political body of voting men. Now that democracies collapsed, obviously, later, and Philip of Macedon and Alexander did not promote democracies, but they kept this idea that the demos, that is, the adult citizen males of a city, were a political body. And that's when, if you had everybody come to the theater for a big debate about something, you could still have people voting on certain things that the city might decide to do, although they couldn't rule themselves completely by themselves. Then you had a smaller council that might be 50 people. It varied the size according to the city. The council is called the boule, which is also on your handout, and that referred to a smaller council of older men usually, who made decisions that they then would put before the demos, the whole voting population. And then you had the term called the ecclesia, which is on your handout. That really did refer to the voting body of the citizens, or the gathered citizens together. The ecclesia is a Greek word, it just means the calling out. Ecclesia, therefore, is what you would call the assembly, the Athenian assembly, who would debate things and vote on things that the boule, the council, would put forward for a debate or a vote. That was called the ecclesia. This is very important because ecclesia then in our Bible gets translated as Ecclesiastes does, but it's called Ecclesiastes because that means the preacher. That's a translation from the Hebrew word, the preacher, Koheleth, for that book. So Ecclesiastes means the preacher, but ecclesia is the term for the church.